here, and that is the final military campaign of the war. So we're skipping over a couple of, more than a year of fighting here to look at this final campaign, and then looking at the war wrapping up, the peace agreement, and of course the overall result. Aside from the obvious ones, aside from the obvious things like clearly American independence, how this changes and how this advances a lot of different ideas, both in the United States and in the world. So where we left things, we left it at Valley Forge in early 1778. At that point, after the loss at Saratoga, the British are going to shift their strategies once again. Let me just kind of set up where we've been here and where we're going. The British once again changed their strategy around 1778, 1779 after the loss of Saratoga, and they're going to shift the war to the south. So this is what I think I have that. Let me see. Yes, I do. So the war moves to the south around 1779. They had been focusing on the middle colonies. That's why the fighting had been taking place in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. That had been where the British were focusing their attention. But after the loss of Saratoga, the British are now going to focus on the south. And so now you will see most, if you were looking at all the battles, which we're not, but you would see fighting in Georgia, in South Carolina, places like that. The British are going to shift the war there because that's where a lot of loyalists are. That's their main purpose. First of all, they have not been successful there in the middle colonies, at least not after Saratoga. And there's a very high concentration of loyalists in the South. There were far more loyalists in the South than there were anywhere else. And who again were the loyalists? Yes. Right, the people that are loyal to the British government. Far more of those in the South than anywhere else. In fact, at this point in the war, loyalist colonists, loyalist Americans, whatever you want to call them, they are actually doing most of the fighting on the British side. They're probably doing at least half of it, at least maybe more, on the British side at this kind of point in the war. And the British are quite successful with this strategy for the first couple of years. Again, we tend to think, after Saratoga is a turning point, the American side wins after that. Not really, because this British campaign to capture the South actually works really well for a while. They are able to capture some important southern cities like Savannah and Charleston are going to fall to the British. They're going to be under British occupation for the rest of the war. And, the situation is kind of bleak for the American side, at least for a while. The American side finally has some key victories at a couple of battles that we're not going to mention here, but a couple of key ones, particularly in the Carolinas, that are going to allow them to finally, around 1780, 1781, start to reverse that British advance. They had been on this advance throughout the South. They had been quite successful with it. But then finally, after some key victories, American forces, the Continental Army, are going to turn that around and start pushing the British out of the South and start pushing them further northward. Okay? And that will lead them into, eventually the British are going to have to retreat out of South Carolina and further up north until Virginia. Now, in command of British forces at this point is General Cornwallis. Okay, General Cornwallis is the British general in command of the British Army at this point in time. I haven't mentioned or asked you to know too many British generals' names because there's been lots of them. But here at the end, I think we should know this fellow's name because he's going to be in command of British forces right here at the very end. So, General Cornwallis, in command of the British forces, they've been pushed out of the Carolinas and forced and retreat into Virginia. And that's going to set up what becomes the final campaign of the war, the campaign and ultimately the Battle of Yorktown, which is in Virginia, and that's in Virginia, Yorktown, Virginia. It's a whole campaign that lasts weeks, but the date up there, October 19th, 1781, that is the day that it ended. That is the last day of fighting. So that's the same week, but it is not just a one-day battle. Yorktown, the plan for Cornwallis at this point, why he chooses Yorktown as the place to retreat to, why he chooses that as the location to bring his army when he retreats out of the Carolinas and starting to move northward. Yorktown is on the coast. It's right there on the Chesapeake Bay, which is the coastline of Virginia, or part of it. And the idea was, the reason he brought his army there was to await reinforcements. What are reinforcements? More soldiers, more help. So they're going to be right there on the coast waiting for reinforcements to arrive, for more supplies to arrive, and all those sorts of things. But Cornwallis doesn't bank on, and the problem that he runs into is by this time the French have started to get into things. Remember how the French, after Saratoga, have promised their help, and that includes the help of supplies and money, but it also includes their navy. And so what ends up happening is that the French Navy is going to be blockading the coast. They're blockading the coast along the Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay. So when Cornwallis retreats to Yorktown, what is he going to find? A blockade. He's blocked out. Okay, there's a blockade there. The French are blocking off any reinforcements from being able to come in, so he cannot get any reinforcements. He can't get any additional men. He can't get any additional supplies, nor can he escape. He's trapped. He ends up trapped at Yorktown, where he cannot get away and he cannot get any reinforcements. And so, what do American commanders like Washington notice about that? What do they decide to do?
They notice that he's trapped, and then they force him to surrender.
Yeah, they say this is the time to attack. He's not going to be able to get away. This is the time to converge all of our forces to consolidate everything we've got, and everybody move towards Yorktown and with deliberate speed and attack while we can, and get the better of him. So that sets up that Yorktown campaign. And again, it is a multi-week, campaign, quite ugly, quite deadly. But in the end, Cornwallis is forced to surrenders to Washington on that date, October 19th, 1781. And what, of course, do we see as the significance of Cornwallis's surrender to Washington at Yorktown? End of the war. Okay, this is the end of the war. This is the last major campaign of the war. Now, at that point in time, with that surrender, they may not, I think it's pretty apparent, but that is certainly the last major campaign that the British Army is going to engage in. There will not, there'll be minor fighting and a couple little skirmishes here or there. But this is, while they're still working out the peace agreement in Europe, that's still going on at this point. So it'll be several months before you have official confirmation that this is the end of the war. But at this time, this is pretty much where the British command, whether it's Cornwallis or people in Europe, decide this war is not winnable, and we're not going to fight it anymore. And so, you won't see a complete withdrawal of British troops and stuff like that actually for quite some time, more than a year in a lot of places. But we do consider this the end of the fighting, the end of the Revolutionary War with that Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. Now, again, the treaty, the peace agreement was already, they were kind of already working on that. There were American diplomats in Paris that were working with British officials on that. After Yorktown, the Americans definitely have the upper hand, and that is certainly where the British authorities decide the war is not winnable and they're not going to pursue it any further. And ultimately, that leads to the peace agreement to officially end the war, the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Remember, you had a Treaty of Paris, 1763, that ended the French and Indian War. So this is why, again, the years here are important. There are multiple treaties of Paris. Typically, I don't ask you to memorize a bunch of random dates, but this is one that you do have to be careful with. You do need to know so that you do not confuse it with the Treaty of Paris, 1763, because they are quite different. Okay, so Treaty of Paris, 1783, you notice this is, 2 years after the fighting starts. All this stuff is not, sometimes I think we tend to learn it, we tend to think that it all just happens like one day right after the other. But because of distance and all those different things, it takes a while for this kind of stuff to finally be agreed upon. But of course, this ends the war, certainly does that, into the fighting and all that sort of stuff. What do you think Britain is forced to recognize, or what do they agree to recognize in the Treaty of Paris, 1783? Yes, so Britain, big thing. Britain recognizes American independence. They recognize American independence, and they recognize the United States of America as a legitimate nation, same as France had done a few years before this. Recognizing that they are no longer their colonies, they don't have any control over them, and that they're not colonies anymore. They are not bound to the British government in any sort of way, things like that. The other big thing, as well as recognizing independence, you have to realize that not only is this the severing of ties politically, are they saying you are now politically separate from us, you are your own political entity. Britain is also losing territory here. There's land that they're having to hand over as well to the new United States. So that's also what the Treaty of Paris 1783 is going to do, is hand over land and define exactly what the United States is as far as boundaries. So, of course, it's going to include those 13 former colonies, now states, but they also grant the United States land to the Mississippi River. So the Treaty of Paris sets up the United States, gives the United States land to the Mississippi River. So that's going to be the western boundary of the new United States, the Mississippi River. So again, they're getting certainly those 13 states, but then as far west as the Mississippi. The southern boundary will be Spanish Florida. Okay, so it goes as far south as Spanish Florida. That's still going to be Spanish for quite some time. You may recall, just on a side note, if you remember, the Spanish had actually lost Florida in the French and Indian War. This is the moment when they get it back, so it's going to be Spanish territory at this point. And of course, the British still retain Canada. That's still going to be theirs. There are some other things in here also about, debts and treatment of loyalists, promising that the loyalists will be treated fairly, that they will get citizenship, they're not going to be punished. Their property, a lot of them had property confiscated and things like that, that it would be returned and all that sort of stuff, and that they would not be, arrested or not given citizenship or something like that. Again, there's a couple of different things about the British withdrawing and a lot of other technical stuff, and some of that will come in a little bit later. But the big things, of course, are recognizing independence, setting up those boundaries, promising to pay off debts, this, that, and the other. And with that, you have, the United States officially recognized by Britain as a new and independent nation. So before, what we'll be looking at, of course, in the next chapter is, where you go from there. Britain says you're independent, but what about governing that new nation? What about setting up that new nation? What's it going to look like? Those are all the things we will deal with in chapter 5. What we want to look at now is look at some of the ways in which the American Revolution changes a lot of things, the way it influences a lot of things, aside from the obvious. Obviously, the American Revolution results in a new nation. It results in the United States. It results in, Britain losing those colonies and all these different things. But it also means symbolic changes. It was very much a revolution of ideas as much as it was a revolution of people revolting against their government for some kind of reason. And that revolution of ideas is going to influence not just Americans, but it's going to have a widespread influence in the world. Perhaps not immediately. Some of that may take decades to develop. But we want to talk a little bit about that, but mostly about how the revolution becomes a symbol for liberty, for freedom, for all those kinds of ideals, and how that then kind of shows up in certain parts of the new American society. So we know some of the principles that the revolution was based upon about social contract and all men are created equal and all those kinds of things. How a word we could use to describe a lot of that stuff, a principle or a belief that the American Revolution seemed to be based on and seems to champion, seems to support, is a principle of egalitarianism, which is a really long, hard to pronounce kind of word that really means something quite, well, not simple, but something you know. Egalitarianism is another way of talking about equality, okay, equality. Egalitarian, if something is egalitarian, that means it is based on some kind of principle of equality. Now, this is where things can get a little bit tricky and things can be easily debatable, because certainly when they talked about equality, I don't think we can hide from this fact. I don't think we can stand up here and say when they talked about equality, when they said all men are created equal, that they meant the same thing that we probably interpret when we hear that. When they said, or when Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, and they talked about egalitarianism and all those things, who did they mean? They meant white men, So while we might look at that phrase, and we might look at this word, and we think that means the equality of all people, of men, of women, of people of different races, and religious groups, and ethnicities, and all those sorts of things, we can't sit up here and say that's what Jefferson was writing about, because they weren't. They meant white men, and not even just white men. Which ones? The ones with property, yeah. So this can get a little tricky, and this can be quite a source of argument and contention and debate about what exactly that meant, and if that makes them good, and if that makes them bad, and so forth and so on. So there's multiple ways we could look at it, but we have to, I think a good way, or one way that I look at it is this. Did they fall short? Absolutely. But there were ways, there were parts of this that were quite revolutionary. because yeah, they did mean they meant white men, they meant rich white men. But they were still, in a way, rebelling against an old view that equality, that rights were something that were inherited, that it was inherited by, aristocratic titles, and that land was only for that aristocracy, that not everybody was entitled to that. So their view of equality was certainly very, very limited. And I don't think we have to excuse that. I don't think we have to say, well, it was okay because that was just the time. We can be critical of it for sure. I think it's just important to remember that their view of it was very different from ours. But it does champion this idea of egalitarianism, of, property being something that everybody should be, all, white men should be entitled to. That it was a person's, initiative and a person's drive and their motivation, and so that was what made a person worthy of something, not what they were born into. So they were looking at things from a very different perspective, although maybe not as radical as we want to think it, or we want to think it to be. But those ideas about power coming from the people and all men are created equal and all those kind of things, we will talk later about how that does inspire some revolutions and some other, similar movements in other parts of the world, like French Revolution, for example. We'll later see revolutions in Latin America that have a direct relationship to the American Revolution. So those are ideas that not only influence the American public and inspire the American Revolution, they will eventually go worldwide. Speaking of that word republic, let's talk about what that means. Because we hear that word all the time, we use it all the time, but it does mean a very specific thing. And a republic is a specific kind of government. Republicanism, first of all, disassociate that word from the modern day Republican Party. Okay, that's not what we mean here. We talk about someone believing in republicanism. We're not talking about the Republican political agenda. We don't mean that. A republic. Look at the first part of that word. What does it look like? First part. First three letters. Okay, what's a rep?
Representative.
A representative. Okay, a republic is a government that represents the people. That's all that means. A republic is a government that represents the people. We've talked about how these Americans, former colonists, have believed ever since the colonial period that government should represent the people. They have established some form of representative government. That is a republic. And they would argue that's what one of the things they were fighting for, that they believed not in monarchy, but in a republican form of government. Again, republican in that sense means a government that represents the people. It has nothing to do with modern day republicans. That's not what we're talking about. But where people are represented. So that is the kind of government that they would have felt they were fighting for. That's what this revolution was about. And that they were fighting for those republican principles of power coming from the people, that power rests with the citizens, that it doesn't rest with the king, it doesn't rest with, an emperor or anything like that, that it should come from the people. And that was truly quite revolutionary in this time. These are people that are from the time when, governments were ruled by kings and monarchs and dictators. And to say that the people have the ability to do that, that was quite revolutionary. So even though they were arguing it in a limited way, in a way they were still doing something that was really quite drastic. Now these principles of republicanism, of egalitarianism, and other kind of enlightenment-based ideas will also influence new state governments that are going to be created in the wake of the American Revolution. Because obviously these colonies, they were colonies, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and all of that. Well, they're not colonies anymore. We don't call them colonies anymore. Now they're states. And so one of the things that will happen as independence starts to be is declared is that those former colonies, now states, will adopt new constitutions and set up new state governments, getting rid of those old colonial governments. Now, oftentimes they will look very similar to their colonial governments, and usually some of the same people are going to run them. But one of the things that eventually all the states will do is write new state constitutions to set up new state governments. So we just want to mention some of the common features, some of the common things among those state constitutions, the similarities they tended to have. First of all, the fact that they are writing constitutions, that in itself is significant. that we've already talked about, or in the colonial period we talked about, like the fundamental orders of Connecticut being the first written constitution. So just by writing constitutions, having a written constitution, that enforces or demonstrates this commitment to a constitutional government. The idea that government needs to be written down, that constitutions are actual written documents. I mentioned it in one of the videos that while we were remote, but the American understanding of a constitution, that it's a written document, is very different from the European understanding and the British understanding of a constitution. In their mind, a constitution was not necessarily a written piece of paper. It was more like just a set of ideas. And to Americans, that never sat well. They were like, well, how do you know what ideas, whose ideas? How do you know what it says and who can change it and all that sort of stuff? It's too arbitrary. So their idea that it is a specific written document that sets up a government that lists what it can and cannot do, that is unique for the time. But it's not just important that they're writing constitutions and that's showing their commitment to limited government. These constitutions tend to have set up three branches of government. That is a common feature, is that they were using that three-branch model, setting up three distinctive branches of government. Whose idea was that originally, about three branches of government? Montesquieu. And most of them already had that as colonies, so it's not like they're all doing that for the first time. There may have been one or two, but they are setting up three branch governments, with a governor, like an executive, with their legislatures, which all colonies had those, so they're just sort of, rolling those over, and judicial systems. Before the United States had a three-branch government, almost all the states did, with those constitutions. Most of these new state constitutions include a Bill of Rights. Pretty much every state has a Bill of Rights as part of their constitution. Why do you think they thought it was important to have a Bill of Rights? Yes?
So nobody can try to take them away.
Yeah, so nobody can try to take them away. Remember, these people, just right before this, they were English people. Did English people have a Bill of Rights?
No.
They did. Remember, English Bill of Rights? So that was something that was a part of their English tradition that they then weaved into their new governments. Many of them had bills of rights even as colonies. So before there was a United States Bill of Rights that we know, most states had them to protect things like right to a trial by jury and to protect property, all that sort of stuff. So a lot of us don't realize that the states had really done a lot of those things and pretty much all of those things before the United States as a whole did. Because they start doing that really as soon as independence is adopted. So states are adopting new state constitutions that usually provide for three branches of government, that usually include bills of rights, and just the fact that it's a constitution demonstrates that they believe government power is limited. It overall that shows a commitment to limited government, that you have to say what the government can do, and therefore, by consequence, saying what they cannot do. Okay, let's talk about how the war enhances freedom of religion. We typically don't think of the revolution have anything to do with religion, and we might think of why would it have any connection to freedom of religion? Well, it does. It's not necessarily fought for religious reasons, you wouldn't say, but the American Revolution actually leads to more religious freedom in the United States in a certain way. Now, keep in mind, as far as freedom of religion, like free exercise of religion, that had always been pretty significant in the American colonies. There was far more religious tolerance in the American colonies than there were in most places in Europe. Now, I know we talked about a lot of examples and several examples which might lead us to think that the colonies were not very religiously tolerant, particularly the example of Massachusetts and the Puritans and all that early on. But after all that, it's kind of like once they get over that, it is quite a religiously tolerant place. As far as free exercise and that kind of thing. We talked about the Great Awakening and how that led to more religious diversity and therefore more religious tolerance. Well, that has continued. So the colonies had really, comparatively speaking, comparing them to Europe, it had always been a place with far more religious freedom because there were so many different religious groups that were here. It wasn't just one. In Europe, or let's just take England, for example, most people are Church of England, and that was the official church, and the other churches were tolerated, but most people were Church of England. you have far more religious diversity here, always have been. And so that had made people just by default more religiously tolerant because there was just more different kind of religions there. The American Revolution actually pushes that a little bit further because of this. What we start to see happening as states are adopting those new state constitutions, we are starting to see, or continuing to see really, the disestablishment of churches, okay, the disestablishment of churches that were remaining. Now, let me talk about what that means, disestablishment. What did it mean to say if a colony had an established church? Yes?
That church and religion represented their colony.
Right, they had like an official church for that colony. Now, did that mean you had to go to that church?
No.
Probably not. It might have early on. But what did it mean? Even if you didn't go to that church, what did it mean? More, not like a personal relationship, but more of a financial one, really. Yeah. You pay taxes to support it. That's right. So if you're looking at a colony that had an established church, let's use Virginia as an example, because at this point, Virginia still had an established church. Virginia's established church was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, which is what most colonies that had an established church at this point, most of them, that's what it was. So you could go to any church you wanted. Some of them had some restrictions, but your taxes supported that particular church. But what we start to see as a result of the American Revolution is those remaining colonies, now states that still had established churches, are starting to disestablish them. So what does that mean if they're disestablishing them?
They're not the official church, so your taxes don't pay them.
Right, they're not the official church anymore, and nobody's tax dollars go to support it. So they're not getting rid of the church, okay? Don't think of it as we're going to abolish the Church of England. Think of it as like, here's the church, and here's the government, and there's a string between them. What are they going to do with the string? They're cutting the string, okay? They're saying, you get to exist, but you don't get tax money anymore. You're not the official church of the colony anymore. Now, there were, as we mentioned before, there were a handful of colonies that never had established churches, like Rhode Island, like Pennsylvania. There were several that had disestablished before this, but there were still a good bit that had an established church. Like I said, Virginia was one of those. But one of the big things that they have to kind of debate about as they're writing new state constitutions is cutting that tie. This is where we see completely what we would call the separation of church and state. Okay, separation of church and state. That phrase that phrase is coined about this time, and I'm pretty sure in reaction to those things. Separation of church and state, meaning a complete separation between the church and the government, that they don't have any sort of relationship with each other, not even a financial one, and that tax dollars don't go to churches. And that's why there's never, an official church in the United States, because a lot of people didn't believe in that. And there were so many different religions, it would have been difficult to do that. So you're seeing more freedom of religion in separation of church and state, the, ending of any kind of established churches that may have still been remaining in some of those particular colonies. Now, another change that we will see that is partially inspired by the revolution and because some logistical things. We kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday when talking about African American service in the American Revolution. But the American Revolution has a profound effect on slavery. In fact, it has probably the biggest, single effect on this institution of slavery than anything else does until the Civil War, which of course eventually does away with slavery completely. But as far as slavery is concerned, the American Revolution does lead to a significant amount of emancipation. Now, emancipation is a fancy word for what? What about slavery? Freedom of slavery, okay? Not quite abolition, but emancipation. Emancipation means to free, okay? So if slaves are being emancipated, they are being freed. That does not mean necessarily that slavery is being made illegal. A slave could be freed while slavery itself still remains illegal. But we do see thousands of slaves emancipated or freed as a result of the American Revolution. Now, for some of them that happens, what did we talk about yesterday that resulted in a lot of slaves being emancipated? Right, a lot of them is because of military service. The British had promised if they fought for them, that they would be free. And so they make good on that promise. There are thousands that are free because of that. There are even more, though, or there are not even more, like a bigger number, but there are more slaves that are emancipated as a result of the revolution, because this is the point where some states will start abolishing it, okay? What does that mean, to abolish it? To get rid of it, to make it illegal, okay? That's different than emancipation. Abolition of slavery would lead to emancipation, but the two things do not have to necessarily go together. But this is the point where some states will start abolishing it outright. Remember, going into this, they all allowed it. Which states do you think are going to be the ones to start abolishing slavery? It's going to be those New England ones. Yeah, it's going to be Massachusetts, Rhode Island, some of those. Why the New England states and not anywhere else? Yes.
They were more diverse, so they were more diverse, so they didn't exactly can't find a word for it.
So that means what in relation to slavery? Because they have a more. Yeah, they don't need the labor, that kind of labor as much. We know that in those colonies or those states, Massachusetts and so forth, slavery had never been as widely used as it was in their southern colonies and all of that. So it's definitely going to be in those New England colonies. However, it's not just a, hey, we don't need this kind of a thing. They did recognize. Sometimes we go, well, how in the world could they be fighting for freedom and fighting for rights and fighting for this idea that everybody, is equal and all this kind of stuff, and keeping slavery? Didn't they see that? They did. Some of them did. And that's exactly why some of those New England states, yes, it was not as economically significant to them, but they did recognize that there was an inconsistency there. They did recognize that it was hypocritical to fight for all those principles while, keeping people as slaves. There were people that even then recognized that as extremely hypocritical. And so that did go into it. It wasn't just about the practicality of, do we need this or do we not need that? Now, we should also remember, though, that emancipation and ending slavery does not mean rights, okay? It does not mean equality. It does not mean that those people being emancipated are going to be full citizens. It does not mean that they are going to be treated equal, all that kind of stuff. And that's sometimes hard for us to reconcile and hard for us to remember, that there's really no concept of civil rights at this point. So, in many of those, even New England states, it may not be legal to keep slaves, but that did not mean that African Americans could vote. It did not mean that they were treated equally or fairly, all those things. So those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand. In your middle states like New York, Pennsylvania, some of those are not going to abolish slavery immediately, but a lot of them are going to kind of approach it gradually, and a lot of those are going to start abolishing it over the next 10, 20 years. So you'll eventually even see it out of those states, in which you'll start to see that divide between slave and free. And so slavery now, it becomes a question as the United States continues to expand about if it would be allowed as the United States expands into new territory. That's one of the things that we'll talk about next time. So with all of this, we now have a new nation. But that's one thing to say that, and something completely different to actually turn those ideas into a functioning government. How do we go about actually governing ourselves and moving forward from war and solving all those problems, so forth and so on. So that's what we'll be looking at in chapter 5, talking about the political structure of this new nation that they're going to create and how that got off to a much rockier start than a lot of us probably realize. So any questions on that much? Let me